Our devotional moment for today is coming from 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We're going to focus on verses 6 through 11, as well as verses 31 through 33. The key terms we want to take a look at today will be typos and doxa. Typos and doxa. The main idea we would have you to consider on today is all for God's glory. All for God's glory. I would ask us just to consider a time where, we had a performance, some activity, even a game, something that happened where we had our parents, guardians, or caretakers out in the crowd, and they was watching us, and our performance made them extremely proud. They were in the audience shouting, that's my boy, that's my girl, that's my baby. And you may be able to identify that even as a parent, seeing your children perform, and go through those milestones. And really what happens in those cases, brothers and sisters, whether we realize it or not, that our performance, our conduct in that situation is actually making our parents look good. That's how they see it. That's really how it's interpreted. That your performance is actually making me look good as a parent, right? It's indirectly, though the crowd may be praising you, the praise is indirectly for me as a parent or for a caregiver, right? Really, whether we bring them glory. I know we don't look at it that way, and we should not look at it that way per se. But when you're in that moment and everything is clicking, you got it going, you're performing, and you're representing your parents well. Ultimately, you're bringing them glory, you're bringing them praise, you're repping them well. And so I will have you just to consider that as we briefly explore 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul has been dealing with a number of items as we've discussed with this congregation, with this community. They have struggled in a number of areas, and he's kind of honed in the last few chapters on two areas in particular, and that is idol worship and sexual immorality. It's that he's really been bringing focus to. And that's understandable because really that was two of the primary things that the Gentiles struggled with as they were coming into the church. Idol worship and sexual immorality. It's the very thing that is addressed during the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. As Gentiles were coming into the church leaders, the apostles, they gathered and they effectively held a meeting. What stipulations are we going to put on the Gentiles, right? What are we going to enforce? Not things pertaining to the law, right? Not circumcision and things of that nature. But they said, really, we have to cause them to realize they have to abstain from blood, from things strangled, right? From idol worship and from sexual immorality. And it's funny because despite, them not understanding that's what they struggle with, it was a continuous struggle. We see it within this community. We see it within this congregation. And so Paul has been bringing focus on these two items, and he'll do it again here in this chapter. But he makes a pivot that I think is very key that we want to take a look at. But as he opens this chapter, he says in verse number 1, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ." So Paul is doing a number of things here as he opens up. He's bringing light to Christ, right? The very spirit of Christ that was even with Israel, right? In the wilderness. You can reflect on the times in the wilderness when they were drinking from a rock, when Moses We understand, and we don't want to get into that detail, but Paul is saying that the Spirit of Christ, the very Spirit of Christ, was with them even in that moment. But the point I want us to catch here is that Paul is saying that all of them benefited from deliverance. All of them benefited from the blessings from God. They all drank from that rock. They all were blessed with the same spiritual drink. They had the same spiritual food, right? So Paul is making it spiritual, right? That rock, though it may have been physical, that Moses spoke to, that manna that came from heaven, the reality is it was God's Spirit. It was His presence that was with them that met their needs, right? And we have to understand that it's always God's presence that's with us. That's where we find the fulfillment of every need being met. We just need God in our midst. And that's what Paul is emphasizing, right? They all benefited from God's presence being upon them. But then he says in verse number 5, nevertheless, however, right, despite all of them being blessed, all of them being benefactors of the spiritual drink, of that spiritual food, he says, nevertheless, in verse number 5, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. And then he transitions in verse number 6, and this series of verses that we're going to look at, it's a chiastic structure that Paul plugs in here. And really what happens is, you make a point, and you start off making a point, right? You kind of project from that point. You take off from the point that you make, and ultimately you land right back at that point. So it's a bracketed, discussion. It's chiastic. And so what he does here in verse number 6, he says, now these things, right? He's referencing the forefathers, those Israelites of old. These things took place as examples for us, right? And that word example comes from the Greek word typos. You can think of type, right? You can think of patterned. It's an example that prefigures or foreshadows what is to come, and so it's an archetype, right? And so Paul is saying these things were given to us. They took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Okay? Then he goes on and he says, do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And notice what Paul is doing here, because again, the Corinthians have been debating with him, right? There's this assumption that I have the right to do anything I want to do, right? I have the right to eat or drink what I want, right? Idols are not real entities. Therefore, I can eat idol food. It's not a big deal. And so now he plugs this in and he says, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, right? And he's reflecting on those passages in Exodus and Numbers, right? And he says, we must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did. And 23,000 fell in a single day. He says, we must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, right? He reflects on the time back in Numbers, right, where the people were grumbling and complaining against God to Moses, and God sends fiery serpents, right? And he judges the people in that moment. And so Paul is reflecting on all of this activity. He says in verse number 10, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happen, right? So he took off with that point, and then he's landing back at that point again here in verse number 11. He says, now these things happen to them as an example. Okay, and he uses this word example. Here is translated typos, but it's from that same root word, tupos, right? It's a type, but more specifically in this case, it means to serve as an example or model, as an example of warning. Okay, as an example of warning in connection with typological interpretation, right? So this is typology that Paul has given us, right? That everything that happened back in the wilderness, that everything happened back with the fathers of old, it was a type for us, right? That we should use it as an example, right? And he says, now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. And then he says in verse number 12, powerful statement, he says, therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. Right? So all of you strong people that think you can do whatever you want to do, right? That I have the right to do what I want to do, that I can eat meat that's offered to idols, right? That I can indulge in all of these behaviors, right? I have the right to do that. He says, let him, right, that thinks he stand, take heed. He's using this imperative, and he's done this time and time again with take care, be careful, right? Be cautious with your behavior. He says, take heed lest you fall. Then he says, no temptation, verse number 13, no temptation has overtaken you, that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide a way of escape that you may be able to endure it. And I want us to think about that relative to the context that Paul has been building upon, right? The sexual immorality, the idol worship, right? You do not have to participate in that stuff, right? There is a way out of it. There is an escape, right? This is, I know we often use this as just broad test of trials, but notice the context that he's been building upon, right? It's this sexual immorality. It's this foul behavior, right? It's these vices that I went through. There's a way to escape that. And then he amplifies this and he says in verse number 14, he says, let me help y'all. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry, right? Flee. It's another imperative. Run away from it. Get out of there. Don't stand there and entertain it. Don't think you're strong enough to endure it. Don't think that you're mature enough to handle that environment. He says, get out of there. Right? Get out of there. Escape from there. Okay? And he says, I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. Okay? And then he goes on and he gets into the Lord's Supper, right? He gets into communion, right? He deals with the cup of blessing. He deals with the blood of Christ. He's dealing with how all, and again, this is the theme that we have to see, that Paul is saying it's one body. All members are able to participate, right? This is for everyone, right? Christ, the Eucharist, right? That communion, that table fellowship, that's for everyone. Everyone can participate in that. But he says in verse number 18, he says, consider the people of Israel are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar. So what is he saying? He's transitioned, right? And we should know this, that when we eat, that when we share of the Lord's table, we're sharing the symbolism is of the body and the blood of Christ, right? I can't separate, or I should not try to separate, right, that bread and that blood from what it really means. I should discern, right, that what the body and what the wine is symbolic of, right? It's the very body and the blood of Christ that was shed for me. So what Paul is saying, he builds upon this argument that they've been having, and now he says, consider the people of Israel are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar. In other words, what he's really trying to say is you can't separate knowingly understanding that a food has been prepared to an idol and then say that you're not a participant in idol worship. It doesn't work like that. No, they go together. If you know that the food has been offered to an idol and you proceed to eat of it anyway, you are absolutely participating in idol worship. And he brings this to light more as he says in verse number 19, what do I imply then, right? What am I saying? Verse number 20, no, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. So think about what he's done here, right? Paul, perhaps he was in agreement with them. Okay, let's just say idols, right? There are no other gods. There are no other lords, right? This is monotheistic. There is only one God, right? There is only one Lord. Let's go with that. He says, but what happens with your pagan worship, it's not an idol, it's a demon, right? You're participating in demon worship, right? So it's the spirit behind that activity that you have to be aware of. And then he goes on and says in verse number 21, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than him? In other words, what Paul is saying, that your activity, your idol worship, it's not about idols. This is demon worship, right? And you cannot serve a demon and God also, right? And he goes through all of this, and then he transitioned as I'm getting ready to close here. Notice what he reinforces in verse 23. All things are lawful, but all things are not helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. He says, let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor, right? And then he goes on and he's given them instruction in terms of conscience. Don't have time to deal with that, but he ultimately comes back down and he ends in verse number 31. He says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Glory is translated from the Greek word doxa. Okay, doxa, glory. And it literally means honor as enhancement or recognition of status or performance. Speaks of fame, recognition, renown, honor, prestige. But really what it means in this context is to the praise of God, right? And so what Paul is saying is, instead of you trying to tread lightly, and instead of you trying to straddle the fence, instead of you trying to understand what rights I have or what rights I don't have, instead of you trying to analyze, right, idols are not real entities, and trying to figure out a way to do what you want to do, right, and trying to connive and manipulate a way for you to feel okay with not doing what's right. He says, why don't we just think about it like this? Anything you do, make sure you're doing it to the glory of God, right? Whatever you eat, whatever you drink, whatever you do, he says, do it all. This is another imperative. Do it all to the glory of God. In other words, understand that God is watching you as that parent, right? As that father, as that guardian, as that caretaker. You're out there performing, right? You're out there doing stuff. You're out there conducting your life in a particular type of manner. But the question we have to ask ourselves when we try to take advantage of freedom of what I think I should be able to do, or if this is okay, or if that is okay, is what I'm doing bringing glory to God? Is it bringing glory to God? Is it bringing praise to God, right? Is it making him look good, right? Is it shining in on the goodness of God? Is it amplifying and illuminating that Christ is in me, right? That Jesus Christ is being glorified in my life? Is it giving glory to God? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. And that's really what Paul comes to. And it's powerful that he's like, okay, listen, we can talk about this over and over again, and we can battle about do's and don'ts. But at the end of the day, is your life bringing God's glory? Is it bringing glory to God? If it's not, stop doing what you're doing and do what's going to bring God glory. And so that's what I want to leave you with on today, brothers and sisters. Wherever you find yourself in life, right? Whatever you find yourself doing, whatever you find yourself contemplating, just sit back and ask yourself, is this going to bring glory to God? Right? This attitude or this response that I have to this person, the way I handle this matter, right? The way I treat people, the way I approach this situation, am I bringing glory to God? It's a question we have to ask ourselves, because at the end of the day, our lives are meant to bring praise and glory to God. Pray this was helpful. Join us again tomorrow for another devotion.